I, again, welcome you all, and I'll pass it off to Steve, who will be our moderator for this afternoon. Go ahead, Steve, thank you.
Thank you, Enrio, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm so glad you can join us for the Committee for Montgomery's program, Social Justice, the Direction of Legislation in Montgomery and Beyond. It's hard to comprehend how much our world, our country, our community, and our lives have changed in the last 6 months between the pandemic, the economic collapse, political turmoil, and the calls for social justice sparked by the killing of George Floyd. The social justice movement is unlike anything I've seen in my lifetime in terms of the number of people involved and their passion and commitment. It's my understanding there have been nearly 100 rallies and protests in Montgomery County alone. And as Chief Jones will be joining us shortly, likes to point out, there has not been a single arrest at a rally or protest in the county. Real reform requires masses of people to change their attitudes and behaviors, but also governments at every level to enforce existing laws and to enact new ones. Today, our distinguished panelists are going to address legislative changes they believe are most necessary and most urgent. Our speakers today are Congressman Jamie Raskin, Attorney General Brian Frosh, who will be joining us later, State Senator Will Smith, who we believe will be joining us in a little bit, Maryland Delegate Vanessa Atterbeary, and Montgomery County Police Chief Jones. Chief Jones just called us before we started to say he got called away with something. Will be joining us shortly. County Executive Marc Elrich will join us later in the program. First, I want to thank our two speakers who are here right now, Congressman Raskin and Delegate Atterbeary, for being here. We know how busy your schedules are. We really appreciate your being with us to address these important topics. First, want to hear from you all about your impressions of the social justice movement and about your legislative priorities related to the movement. I will then ask some questions of you and other panelists as they join us. We will then turn to questions from our audience. And as Enrio said, we ask our audience to please post questions in chat conversations, and those will be passed on to me. With that, Congressman Raskin, let me turn it over to you. Please talk about your impressions of what's going on in our country regarding social justice, and then what your legislative priorities are.
Great. Let's see. Are you hearing me, Steve? Let's see. Steve, are you guys hearing me? Yeah. Well, I'm delighted to be with everybody. Delegate Atterbeary, hello, nice to see you. And it's a pleasure to be with everyone. You know, I mean, democracy itself is perhaps the greatest form of social justice, because it's democracy by which we're able to use government as an instrument to rectify every possible injustice and inequality and unfairness in society. The reason I think we're in such trouble in America today is that we are seeing the basic norms of democracy eroding and under attack. And in many ways, we're becoming like a failed state. You know, a healthy social justice state delivers the basic goods of life to people, like protection against disease. And if you don't do that, and people suffer the terrible misfortune and injustice of being exposed to a disease unnecessarily, the state's not functioning. And so, you know, America's leading the world right now in COVID-19. We're number one in case count with more than 6 million cases. We're number one in death count with more than 180,000 people lost. And still, we have no nationwide plan on how to get out of this nightmare. And we know that the pandemic continues to afflict the poorer population worse than wealthier people, people who live in tighter quarters and in apartments more than people who live in houses. And it's especially hit the African American, Hispanic, Native American, Indian communities very hard and disproportionately hard. But that's just one example. I mean, it's the same thing with gun violence. You know, a failed state does not deliver to people basic security against random gun violence. That is a good that has been secured to people in most advanced democratic nations all over the world, and America is a complete outlier. Nobody even comes close to us in terms of the number of people who die by gun violence. And so we've not dealt with that problem. Healthcare and health insurance itself, I mean, even with the Affordable Care Act, we still have tens of millions of people who still have not gotten insurance. And, you look at the calamities of climate change, I'm tempted to say we're a failed state environmentally when we withdraw from international action to combat climate change, and we stick our heads in the sand and we're engaged in denialism instead. And that too has a dramatically disproportionate and disparate effect on poorer people who can't afford to wall themselves off from all of the calamities that are associated with climate change. So I guess what I'm saying is that social justice is not a peripheral or exceptional thing. Social justice is at the very heart of democracy and trying to make government work for people, because people depend on government in a democratic society. Government is just us, and it's got to be an instrument for the public interest and the common good, and not for the self-enrichment of people who happen to get into government. And so all of us who aspire and attain to public office really are nothing but the servants of the people. And if we instead head down a road where people get into government, use government for their own purposes, it's a really dangerous thing. So I would like to think that almost everything that I'm working on right now, including decriminalization of marijuana as an offense at the federal level, the HEROES Act to get funding for unemployment insurance, to get funding for the states, the counties, the local governments, and efforts to restrain gun violence and to have a universal violent criminal background check. All of these things are attempts to make democracy work, which is to say, attempts to promote the cause of social justice.
Thank you, Congressman Delegate Atterbeary.
Hi, good afternoon, and thank you for having me. I'm the outlier. I'm the one non-Montgomery County person on the panel. So for those of you who don't know me, I am Delegate Vanessa Atterbeary, and I represent District 13 in Howard County. I was first elected in 2014 and re-elected in 2018 when I was appointed to serve as Vice Chair of the Judiciary Committee. And I'm participating in this panel presumably because the Speaker of the House, Adrienne Jones, she created, after the murder of George Floyd, she created a work group to address police reform and accountability in the House, and I'm chairing that work group. And so I will be working with Senator Smith, who started out in the House with me on Judiciary Committee until now Congressman Raskin left and he moved over to the Senate. So I'm looking forward to working with Senator Smith on these issues. So, you asked us to touch base on kind of where we are in the United States and in Maryland, and certainly in Montgomery County and Howard County, and we've had protests. I don't know if we've had that many out here, but we've had our fair share of protests out here. And, I think people are just frustrated, particularly people of color, Black and brown people. We are frustrated with being treated by the police for decades and decades the way that we have. And we're seeing it being played out on TV, on social media, and certainly, unfortunately, George Floyd was not the first murder to happen at the hands of police. We had Michael Brown years ago who said, "I can't breathe." We fast forward, we had Freddie Gray. I was elected at the heels of Freddie Gray, and we had a police accountability work group in the House at that time in 2016 to address police reform. And so now, during this pandemic, when we've all been at home in quarantine, we've seen George Floyd, we saw Jacob Blake just happened. We're waiting for justice for Sandra Bland. We have had our own incidents here in Maryland, and certainly in Montgomery County. There have been several incidents. So I think people are fed up. it's difficult for me sometimes because I look at these situations not just as a legislator, but as a mother of 3 Black children. I have a son who's 8, who's big for his size, so I worry about him being out and about and being stopped by the police. I have a son who's 7, and I have a daughter who I had right before I was first elected, and she is now 5. So I worry about these issues as a mother and also as a legislator. In the House, we have a very specific agenda that the Speaker wants us to take a look at, and it's really taking a look at 4 issues. The first is taking a look at policies and procedures related to investigations of misconduct, including the Law Enforcement Officer's Bill of Rights. The second is determining whether or not we should have a uniform use of force throughout the state of Maryland. We have about 148 different police departments just here in the state of Maryland. When you take a look at the larger jurisdictions like Prince George's and Montgomery counties, to the city, to your colleges and universities, to the actual state police. So should they all have one standard? The third is the use of body cameras and releasing that footage to the public. Not all jurisdictions use body cameras. I was certainly surprised to learn that in Howard County, we don't have body cameras here. And then finally, taking a look at whether or not we should have independent investigations and prosecutions when there has been a use of force by the police on a citizen, in particular when there's been a shooting and a death, but also other aggravated uses of force. So those are the things that we are specifically taking a look at. We've had a series of meetings already. We actually have only one meeting left before we start to hash through our recommendations that we're going to present to the Speaker in October, that we will move forward with legislation. We had a public hearing in August 27th, I believe, or August 6th. And we had, within the first 20 minutes of sign up, we had 100 people sign up to testify virtually. And certainly if we were in Annapolis, physically there, we would have had significantly more than that. So those are the things that I'm focused on now, is working through those issues. And in the due process that normally happens, whatever we suggest and moves through legislation will come through the Judiciary Committee in normal course and have more hearings, and then we'll have to, kind of have a meeting of the minds with the Senate, which is sometimes hard to do. Another thing that I'm very passionate about is, it took me a couple years, but I was able to pass a bill that unfortunately the governor vetoed, that did require background checks for rifles and long guns here in the state of Maryland, which would have made us a state that required background checks for all guns. And unfortunately, he vetoed that, and it was a horrible time to veto that, because with the pandemic and people being isolated, we have more mental health issues, we have more domestic violence issues, and there was a spike in the sale of rifles and shotguns right when we were all quarantined, and there was a glitch in the background check system. So there was one point where there was a large group of people walking around who in fact did not have a background check, but were sold those rifles and shotguns. So these are some of the things that I'm working on, and I'm look forward to answering questions from everyone. So thank you again.
Sorry, muted there. Thank you, Delegate Atterbeary, and County Executive Elrich has joined us. Marc, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you.
So the question asking first round here is just your impressions of what's going on in terms of the social justice movement, and for you within the county, what your legislative priorities are. Just keeping the answer to a few minutes, and then we're going to follow up with questions.
This social justice movement is a continuation of social justice movements. And I'm somebody who takes a pretty skeptical view of the civil rights legislation that on the one hand was landmark legislation, and on the other hand, never dealt with the underlying root causes of inequality. So you pass rights on paper, but it never undid the economic damage that was done to people, never undid the lack of education, never undid the lack of opportunity, never rebuilt the slums, never did anything that might have actually changed people's lives and the lives of the children that they raised. And, as I view this as, America's work is largely unfinished, and we have to get down to it. And I'm not surprised. I mean, I'm surprised that it took George Floyd rather than what could have been any murder in any year that could have triggered what was triggered by the last one. There was nothing particularly astonishing. Maybe it's the fact that you get to see everything on TV now. It's sort of like the Vietnam War. You know, once live pictures from the front started beaming into people's houses, that war looked a whole lot less glorious. It was, you know, a lot less, you know, our guys are off there fighting, and it looked a lot more messy and a lot uglier. And I think, you know, that people's cameras have made what we see and have taken it granted in some communities have endured forever, has made it painfully obvious what they endure. But the real challenge is going to be, first of all, getting rid of Trump, and then having Democrats come in with an actual agenda. I mean, I do think about how many years the Republicans governed with enough votes from the Democratic Party that basically they were able to get an agenda passed. I hope the Democrats can get enough seats that, and a commitment to a platform up and down the party in both houses, that we can pass legislation that we need to pass, and we can start dealing with some of this stuff. Issues that are important to me in the county, you know, housing continues to be a big issue, and I continue to, you know, feel like we need more support for ownership. I've, you know, been engaged with nonprofits and raising the issue of, and I need you to stop buying and acquiring rental property. I need you to work with people to transition the property to ownership. Because if all I do is rent people property, rent control or not, you know, that doesn't even solve the problem, because as long as you're a renter, you never build wealth. And if you don't build wealth, there's no, you know, getting a home loan to send your kid to college or give your kid a down payment or all the things that my parents were able to do for me. And my parents were, you know, a waitress and a postal clerk, and they could still manage that. And there are plenty of people who have comparable situations and can't manage that.
Mark, let me, if I may interject just a question here based on something you said. And first for Jamie, I mean, Mark raises a good point, it seems, that there was landmark legislation in the 60s especially, and that addressed a lot of the issues we're still dealing with today, and yet we're still dealing with these issues today. Why do we think that legislation can fix what's wrong with our country?
Well, legislation alone won't fix it. I mean, legislation works best when it's anchored in social movements that are changing things on the ground for people and changing the way that people relate to each other and change people's concepts of what's possible to do in their towns, their cities, their counties, their states, and so on. But having said that, the legislation, I think, has been profoundly important in terms of endowing people with rights that they can use to sue when they're being discriminated against. I mean, and you know, there's always this kind of rollback process, right? And you know, we've had two great periods of Reconstruction in American history, and one was after the Civil War, which lasted for 12 years before the former Confederates were able to recapture the state governments, and there was kind of a sellout at the national level in 1876. It lasted for 12 years, and then it was undone, and then that kicked off 75 years of Jim Crow, American apartheid. And then John Lewis, Bob Moses, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee kicked off with the sit-ins in the South and the voting rights movement, another Reconstruction that included the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65, which did tremendous things, but they too are subject to political and judicial sabotage by right-wing politicians and right-wing Supreme Courts. And America is on the precipice, I hope, I think, I pray, on the precipice of another Reconstruction. That if we can get the electoral and political system to work properly, then we could be ready to see dramatic sweeping changes like we did in those prior points in our history. So I'll give you an example. You know, we have millions of unrepresented people. So we have 700,000 people down the road in DC who are the only residents of a capital city on earth who are not represented in their federal legislature. And we passed statehood for Washington, D.C. in the House of Representatives. And of course, the Senate under Mitch McConnell didn't even take it up. But if we could get that done, that would be a big step forward. 3.5 million people in Puerto Rico who have no voting rights in Congress, not even for president. We've got to stand up for our brothers and sisters in Puerto Rico and say they've got to be part of the American community too. They saw what happened in Hurricane Maria, where they got cheated out of hundreds of millions of dollars in hurricane assistance, and they got some paper towels and a photo op by President Trump. And the same thing happened to the people in D.C. With COVID-19 money. Even though they're not a state, they've been treated as though they were a state for purposes of program funding. They got cheated out of that this time and lost $750 million in COVID money, which obviously affects everybody in our region, because a lot of my constituents, and I assume Vanessa's constituents, I know Marc's constituents, go to Georgetown and GW and Howard and hospitals in DC. All of which is to say that there are these systems of inequality which we just accept as okay. And I guess the point of view I like to take, and it's on the optimistic side, but it's the one that John Dewey articulated, which is that the cure to the defects of democracy is more democracy. And if things aren't working right, you need more democracy to push things in a stronger direction. I think that's exactly where we are. And I've got to say, Black Lives Matter is one of the most hopeful things that I've seen in my entire life. A movement of young people on the streets, people with tremendous political, moral, physical courage, backed by 70 or 80% of the American people. I mean, we can see why there are attempts to sabotage it, to poison it with violence, to take pictures of violence and blame it on the movement. And so it's a hard time now, but Dr. King went through that, SNCC went through that. All of the great movements have gone through that process of provocateurs who try to tar them with the brush of violence. But we've got to stay very clearly on the nonviolent side. As my colleague John Lewis said, it's only nonviolence that has worked. If you look at like the last 50 years of our history, the wars haven't worked. The Vietnam War didn't work. The Iraq War didn't work. All of the violence, the gun violence, the assassinations, they haven't worked except to drive us backwards. But it's the nonviolent movements for change that have succeeded. And we've got to renew that process, beginning next year. And I hope that we can hang on to our democracy until then.
Yeah. Thank you, Jamie. Delegate Atterbeary, question for you, and then I'll come to you, Marc. So same question for you is, and most of the landmark legislation was at the federal level, but what confidence do you have that new legislation that you and your colleagues are able to get through and get Governor Hogan to sign will make a difference, given what's happened in the past?
Thank you. So I think, there's a saying that all politics is local. And I think, here in the state of Maryland, particularly at the General Assembly, we've been able to pass some things, and hopefully we'll be able to pass some things that, because given what's going on in Washington, we haven't been able to do at the federal level, but hopefully after November, we will be able to, like the background checks. So particularly if we're talking about policing, I think some of these things we do have to legislate, because right now, the way some of the police departments are operating, it isn't transparent and they aren't accountable. So hopefully, we can pass legislation related to the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights that will allow some civilian participation and will allow transparency of police records. That will affect if a police officer is involved in a shooting that results in murder, things like, is that officer on paid leave or administrative leave or desk duty? We can legislate things related to training. We can legislate things related to decertification of officers when there's been a felony or some other situation that's happened. We can legislate things, and it's sad that we have to legislate some of these things, but they're addressing some issues that are going on right here in the state of Maryland. We can legislate, you have to look into, if it's an officer that comes from a different state, you have to look into his record. That's what happened on the Eastern Shore in Anton Black. That was an egregious officer who was hired, and then he ended up murdering Anton Black, who your very own Delegate Gabe Acevedo is fighting for justice for. He's from Montgomery County in Gaithersburg, Germantown. So these are the types of things that, you know, we can legislate at the state level that hopefully, you know, isn't going to poof change what's going on, but can start the change and start the process where society here in our state feels like we can start to have that better communication and trust with police here in the state of Maryland.
Marc, you have a situation that neither Jamie nor Vanessa have, and that is it's Democrats everywhere you look, and your own party. So, which should make a clearer path, one would assume, for introducing and passing legislation that really could move things. What, over the next 3 or 4 months, tell me, if you can, you know, maybe the 2 bills that you feel confident you can get through that will most effectively address some of the social justice issues in Montgomery County. You're muted. There you go.
I'm unmuted. Somebody else did that. Thank you. You know, what we're dealing with right now is trying to stay afloat physically. And, you know, I try to remind people, you know, I have a $6 billion budget, but when the school system and everything else is subtracted out of the $6 billion, I've got $930 million of fungible money. And I'm about to run out of a bunch of it based on what we think are going to be reductions in tax revenues. So it's been really hard for us to think about, you know, what do we add and what do we do more of in a context of how do I keep doing the things that we're trying to do. But I will say that, you know, we're putting a lot of emphasis on early childhood, and we're hoping that the state continues down the path they were on so we can actually provide enough early childhood education opportunities that we can actually, you know, make a difference. It's really important that kids get started on a more equal footing than they're able to get started right now. And it's important for parents to be able to go to work and not have to make a decision that, you know, it costs as much to pay for childcare as I'm going to earn, so I might as well not go to work. We've really got to get those supports in place. And the county's been willing to make investments, and we're going to continue to make investments. We're looking at doing things a little bit differently with our housing programs. We're trying to reach deeper levels of affordability. So we're not just talking about MPDUs. The first deal we signed with a group of developers got us units at 30, 40, 50, 60, 70% of AMI, area median income, so we can start serving the bulk of the population that's low income and also doesn't qualify for MPDUs because they're so low income. I have a bigger problem below the MPDU level than at the MPDU level. And people think that because we do the MPDUs, you know, where the cats meow, it's very nice, but it doesn't actually deal with the real constraints we have. I've got 20,000 families who are probably paying 50 to 60% of their income on housing. They make $30,000 or less. That's my starting problem. It doesn't include people who are coming here, but that's important to me. We're reconfiguring how we do services. You know, we've talked a lot about how we've been forced to do hub models where we get our people out of the offices and into communities, and you're providing multiple services out of facilities. I believe that's going to become the norm, and it's going to get us closer to the community, and people aren't always going to have to go to Rockville or whatever to, you know, to get a service or to meet somebody. We're going to try to plant more things out in the communities where people are. And those are big things for us. We launched the police reform thing last night. So we had an amazing discussion. We had more than 70 people on. I've got a committee of both civilians and staffers. Staffers can't vote, the police can't vote, but the community gets votes on this. And we're going to do a deep dive into what do we need to do to change things in the police department to try to deal with some of these inequities.
But let's stay there, and I want to start with you, Marc, and then go around. Let's talk about police reform, which I understand, and well-timed, just as the subject of police reform comes up. Chief Jones has joined us. Chief, thank you so much for being here. County Executive Elrich was just starting to talk about police reform, and I'll come to you in just a minute. Marc, tell me about, I realize the task force had its first meeting last night. Talk to me about what you think are the priorities in your mind. I know the task force is going to investigate, but what are your priorities for police reform?
Well, first thing is to benchmark what we're doing. And then to bring in a consulting group that can look at our promotional policies, who gets promoted and why. To look at our hiring policies. We still, in our public safety forces, are way disproportionately white. And I've looked at recruit classes and wondered where are other people from other groups here. We need to do a better job of recruiting. We're going to look at, not just the use of force policies, but there are other things, and when people complain and they show us these videos of people doing protectual stops and trying to get somebody to get a search in their car or stopping young kids with marijuana, something for which we don't even prosecute in Montgomery County, and we're doing this kind of stuff. It's like, why are we doing this? And why aren't we doing other things that are more important? And so we want the community to bring their experiences. If you got to see the group last night, it's a stunning mix of experience and expertise. And we want them, along with our consultant groups, to be able to come back and give guidance to the committee that the council and I have appointed that's going to be an ongoing group. And to the extent that they show us things that we can do more quickly, I will do them administratively rather than wait to do a further study and then have to go through the legislative process. If we see obvious stuff, we're going to do it. Right before COVID hit, we had just finished a study and a report on decriminalizing homelessness, because this is another horrible situation where you fall into homelessness, you throw something on the ground, you wind up with a ticket, you don't appear in court because you have no fixed address. Now you've got a warrant for your arrest. I mean, I've had people tell me these horror stories that leads to criminal records, and then now I've made you unemployable on top of being homeless. So we want to be able to look at things and figure out, how do we separate out things that ought to be handled by police? How do we figure out what should be handled by Health and Human Services and housing?
So let me turn to Chief Jones, who I think is in the car, hopefully not driving. Chief, thanks so much for being with us. You heard what County Executive Elrich said, and the task force had its first meeting last night. There's moves afoot in the county council dealing with police reform. What do you think the key issues are in Montgomery County? But also, what are the efforts outside of the internal reforms? What worries you about them?
So, and I apologize for being late. And thank you. No, I'm not driving, Steve. Thank you so very much for that. I will tell you, we in the police department, I think in any agency across this country really needs to look hard at internally at its practices. I think we've always looked for a reform. We've always looked to improve our practices. We've done that with our use of force policy over the years. We'll continue to do that. I think in any policy we've looked for, because things change, laws change. There are rulings by the Supreme Court. There are rulings by our Maryland courts that require us to police differently, to have a different focus. And so there are things that are happening in our communities that we have to focus on keeping our communities safe. So, with that being said, when we look at how our officers are being utilized and over time, and one of the things I've always stated is the fact that, like, for example, in the world of mental health, I've seen over the course of my 35-year career, really the lack of commitment on behalf of many entities that includes government, politicians, hospitals, that have really not provided the amount of attention needed to the mental health community. And at the end of the day, the police department has been left with, because we are the organization that is working 365 days a year, 24 hours a day. And the easiest number to pick up the call is 911. And that becomes the end result for many of the issues that are noted. So with that being said, we have officers that are truly committed to working and getting people the help that they need. I have those examples of those officers doing their work each and every day, though it does not get magnified by anyone, and it actually is distraughting in many ways, because you have officers who do really good work. But again, at the end of the day, we can always be better. You'll have people who have their grievances, and that we need to listen. I think in regards to where we are in our today's society, and particularly where we are right now, this is a time for all of us to listen. But not only do I expect the community to listen, to provide us with excellent feedback of the experiences they've gone through, but I would also hope that the people would listen to us, to listen to what we do, to make sure that they are obtaining the real facts and not just rumor and innuendo, and for us to show them the reality of those successes. And I'll even be glad to look at those failures. And that's where I've stated with County Executive Elrich, when I first took over, that I wanted us to do an audit for this department, because I thought that because people have a high expectation for this department, and that there are lots of things that are out there that needs to be explained. I think the experts who know how to look at data, who know how to talk to people in our community in order to gather the information and provide a report, I think that's important for us to look at that feedback and take the wins where the wins are and take the losses and look to improve upon those areas where we need improvement.
So can I just, quick follow-up question? So that's what you'd like to see done. What concerns you about efforts to reform the police?
So what concerns me is the morale of my department. Mm-hmm. And this is a problem all across this country. And I am very concerned about the morale of our department, because sometimes the officers feel as if the community is not supporting them. And that comes even from my level and even higher at the top. When they feel like the community is not supporting them, they feel like their sense of worth is really not much. And they feel like what they're doing is actually being more criticized than it is acknowledging the work that they do when they go out each and every day. And where is that going to lead us? Is that going to lead us to the world of people just not engaging at all? A lack of engagement, acts of depolicing? That's what concerns me. And I work very hard each and every day, as well as my staff, in order to make sure that we can maintain the morale of our department, because I think that's where we are right now.
Yeah. Congressman Raskin, if I can turn to you, realize much of police reform efforts at the local level, but it is also an issue at the utmost discussion on the national level. What do you think the priorities should be, both locally and nationally, in terms of reforming police?
Well, I appreciate that. And I want to say to Chief Jones, I appreciate very much his remarks and the hard work that the Montgomery County officers have been putting in during this period. And I've been impressed. I've been, I don't know how many, 6 or 7 different BLM protests in our county, and the police are always there. And there's always a wonderful rapport and interaction between the officers and the protesters. And that is not the case in most parts of the country, or certainly a lot of the country. Well, look, more than 2 months ago now, we passed the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which has 15 different components to it. It was led by the Congressional Black Caucus. It came out of the committee that I serve on, the Judiciary Committee, and we're very proud of it. I mean, it abolishes racial, ethnic, religious profiling. It bans chokeholds and carotid holds. It establishes the principle that police receiving federal funds can only use lethal force in order to save life. In other words, you don't put your knee on somebody's neck when they're already handcuffed for no reason. You use lethal force only when you need it to save life. We abolished the doctrine of qualified immunity, which was made up by a bunch of judges, which just makes no sense when you really look at it. We create a national database for police officers who've been convicted of police brutality or been removed because of police brutality from the force. So somebody isn't, fired in New Jersey and then they resurface in San Diego and nobody knows who they are. So There's some very good stuff in there. Now, this being the Congress of 2020, it passed overwhelmingly in the House, but nothing has moved in the Senate. So I'm hopeful that we'll be able to revive the legislation before this Congress is all over. But if not, that we'll be able to get it passed next year. And I know that Delegate Atterbeary and my successor in office, Senator Will Smith, who's the chair of the Senate Judicial Proceedings Committee, are devoted to advancing a very similar kind of program at the state level. And I know they'll be working with the county executive, with Chief Jones, so everybody is getting input into it, and it's something that everybody feels fairly reflects where we are as a people in Maryland, as a community. And so I'm grateful that we've got different levels of government working at this at the same time. And I just hope, we don't get distracted into a lot of peripheral provocations and diversions, which are not central to what we're trying to do, and that actually could get people hurt or killed. And we know people are getting killed, like the two young men who were killed by Kyle Rittenhouse a couple of days ago, who showed up at the protests in Kenosha. And I'm actually advocating something, Steve, of trying to get the NFL and the NBA and Major League Baseball to get players to form squads of people who will go out to the protests to demonstrate their solidarity with Black Lives Matter, but also to get people to cool it, to cool down any provocateurs who are coming from anywhere. And we know a lot of the extreme right-wing websites are sending people in to try to create violence, and also to establish a certain norm that America is present. We're not going to sit back like a bunch of spectators and just watch people fight and kill each other. I'll be interested to see what exactly the president has to say now that he's arrived in Kenosha, and whether he's throwing gasoline on the fire or whether he's actually trying to advance some reconciliation.
Before I turn it over to you, Delegate Atterbeary, just a reminder to folks who are watching this on Zoom, soon we're going to turn over to your questions. So if you have a question you'd like to ask one of our panelists, just pose it in chat, and it will get passed on to me. Delegate Atterbeary, just ask you quickly to address the subject again of police reform. From your standpoint, what do you think in general, not necessarily Montgomery County specifically, should be the top priorities?
So, and I just want to also touch on a couple of things that were said. The purpose of the House work group was to specifically get input, and I strongly believe we need input from everyone, from the community, from the police chiefs and sheriffs, and legislators, and all of the advocates. Our last meeting we had last week, was specifically with the police chiefs and sheriffs, who gave us their perspective, with the Fraternal Order of Police, with the Maryland State Troopers Association, with their labor organization, with the past president of the National Black Police Organization. So, we are, when we are looking at legislation, not just looking at it from one perspective, from the House's viewpoint. So I absolutely want to make that clear. From our perspective, we are focused on this work group, and we will have other legislation related to police. So I'm just speaking on the work group and the things that we are going to take a look at. For instance, I'm just getting texts while I'm speaking to all of you from the chair of the Judiciary Committee, Luke Klippinger, out of Baltimore City, and we're talking about mental health issues related to policing issues. So we're going to have bills related to that aren't necessarily going to come out of the work group. We certainly will have bills related to the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights. We will have a bill related to the use of force, and whether we implement a statewide standard. We will definitely make a decision about body cameras and implementation. And I'll suggest, I don't want to presume what the work group's going to do, but I'll suggest there'll be possibly staggered implementations so that budgets and funding and all that can get lined up. And we'll also be making recommendations and posing legislation related to independent investigations. And, you know, York County, Montgomery County, and Howard County, where I am, there's an agreement there with both of our state's attorneys to you know, we'll take on a use of force incident from Montgomery County and vice versa. So whether or not we're going to propose something like that, or propose, you know, that the AG handle it, or some other independent organization that we create, we certainly will address that. And then there's all of the other, I think, things that fall under use of force, like chokeholds. We'll address that, duty to intervene, training, all of those things that you kind of hear out in the media and some others, we will address kind of under the umbrella of use of force. So if anyone is interested, you can go to the Maryland General Assembly website. If you click on committees and you click on House, you'll see the Police Reform and Accountability Work Group, or you can just, there's a search engine there on the website, and all of our meetings are live streamed, but the videos are up there, and all of the public hearing testimony. Some folks uploaded videos if they couldn't sign up on time, because we only took the first 100 people. So that certainly, I'm sure the folks that are viewing and listening to us today would certainly probably be interested in taking a look at.
Thank you. I have another question for last question for Congressman Raskin when he returns, but let's dive in now to the questions from our audience. The first one is, Montgomery County is one of the most diverse counties in the country. Most of the county residents are from countries where policing is viewed differently. How is MoCo working to build relations with the various cultures and ethnicities living here? I might just add, as part of that question, the NewYorkTimes.com, there's a calculator where you can put in what county you're from, and it will tell you how many years it will take for the rest of the country to catch up to your county in terms of diversity, or vice versa. But for Montgomery County, as it is now, the rest of the US won't be as like Montgomery County until the year 2049. So with that, let me first turn to County Executive Elrich to answer the question of how is Montgomery County working to build relations with various cultures and ethnicities living here. Chief Jones, I'll ask you that next.
Well, last summer, I had a forum where I asked people to come and talk, and we filled the high school auditorium. And we wanted people to speak frankly about what they experience in the department and what they feel about policing. And the kickoff event yesterday, assembled a smaller group, but a similar intention group to give us a sense of, how do they perceive policing? What is the view in the community? Marcus knows that this is an issue here. And that we need to deal with it. And, I believe if we're going to do community policing, we have to do real community policing, which doesn't mean the police police the community. It means the police work with people and don't treat everything as a law enforcement solution, but sometimes just get to know people and work with them. And that's going to be a project, I think, that it's going to be ongoing. There is no quick fix to this. I was talking to a friend of mine who had just served on a jury trial, and what she said really depressed me, which was that people on the jury would not vote to convict because they don't believe anything a policeman says. When you've gotten to the point that people either feel they're going to be unjustly policed or don't believe anything that policemen say, then you've got a real trust issue in the community. And this person wasn't a particularly radical person, or, this was just somebody who just happened to be called up for jury duty and was kind of stunned by the way they felt. And we've got to build back a level of trust and confidence that has been really eroded. And it's not just eroded by the things that happen here, but people see what happens all over the country. And it is undermining all the police departments, all of them.
All right, Chief Jones, can turn that one over to you.
Yes, and I appreciate that question. Diversity has been something that really has been the topic of this art. I know in my police department for many years, and in fact, I was engaged with teaching culture diversity. That we had developed a program specifically for our department back in 2006, an award-winning program where we focused our attention not only on the on race, but we also focused on religion, on generational differences, and particularly because we have such a unique community here in Montgomery County of the different cultures. It's vitally important for our department to, and the members of our department to be rightly aware, acknowledge and understand some of these, many of these cultures that many of us had never been really had any exposure to. And so that's something that's vitally important. And in our community engagement division, in our district stations, we have focused our attention on really engaging in many of these different types of communities. That continues to have to grow. We have to continue to grow this and develop these relationships. To be able to build trust, you have to have relationships in our community. And that's the one thing that I have focused and really made sure our officers understand how they have to develop these relationships in our communities, because that's how you trust people. In any given relationship that you have with a friend, with a spouse, with a partner, is that it comes from the relationship that you know each other and you can trust what each other says and believe what they're going to do is what they do. So that's where it has to begin. Again, we have to be better. We are working to be better, and we have to be acknowledging that there are differences and we respect people's differences. And that's something that Montgomery County continues to drive, and we will continue to strive to be better in that regard with the police department.
Thank you, Chief. Despite what the name tag says there, that is not Nina who has joined us. That is Attorney General Brian Frosh. Attorney General, thank you for joining us. We're just having participants, the audience ask some questions, but I do want to ask you a question that we asked the other panelists, and that is just your impressions of what is going on so far with the social justice movement, and what laws you think, A, they're most important to be enforcing that perhaps are not being enforced, and B, new legislation we need to address some of the challenges.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. I apologize that I'm here late. It was a scheduling mix-up. And I'm sorry I missed my colleagues who've already spoken. But let me tell you what our office is focusing on. We know that Delegate Atterbeary and Chairman Clippinger and Chairman Smith, the General Assembly, is keenly focused on the criminal aspects of the justice issues that are before us. Our office set up a COVID-19 Access to Justice Task Force, and we've drawn from the General Assembly all of our congressmen, save one, are working with us. Congressman Raskin has been a great help, and so have Senators Cardin and Van Hollen. And we're looking at the civil issues that arise from COVID-19. And the one that's most obvious and most immediate is the housing issue. We expect that if things go forward as they are today and without any change in policy by either the courts or the governor, that about 330,000 Marylanders will lose their homes sometime in the next few months. We are facing just a storm of evictions that started yesterday in court. Our task force, there are members, as I say, from both the General Assembly and Congress, but also from throughout the state, landlords, tenant advocates, business executives, and experts in each one of the areas in which we expect civil issues to arise. And housing is the most immediate, but obviously there are healthcare issues, there are unemployment issues, there are the way state government operates. So our panel, our task force will come up with recommendations by, we hope, the beginning of December, so that the General Assembly can take action on them as quickly as possible when they reconvene in January. We've taken a couple of actions already, made recommendations, first to the courts, and second, and more importantly, to Governor Hogan. We've asked the governor to extend the moratoria that existed on evictions in our state. We recognize that landlords, in order to stay in business, in order to continue to own the buildings, they've got to pay the mortgages, and we have to find relief for them. But the last thing we need right now in the middle of a pandemic is to have thousands and hundreds of thousands of people who are turned out into the streets. Their health is imperiled, and the health of every single person in our state will be endangered if we have an increase in homelessness that we could see as a result of the need. We wrote a letter today, the task force wrote a letter today to Governor Hogan, asking him to take about $150 million from the CARES Act money that Maryland has received and use it for rent relief, pay the rent of the folks who are in arrears so that they don't get evicted, so that the landlords can have the money to pay the mortgages. And secondarily, our office won a settlement. I think it was about $20 million in its entirety for Wells Fargo. We end up with a surplus of about $9 million that we were paying back money to the subdivisions and to the state who lost money because of the 2008 financial crisis and violations of law that were engaged in by the various different international banks. We have about $9 million left over. That money has to be spent on housing relief. We offered it up to the governor to use to bring relief to tenants during this crisis, and are hopeful that out of the $2.4 billion that Maryland received, and only, as far as we can tell, only about $400 million has been spent, that he can put together the money to provide relief for folks. So that's been our most immediate focus. We will address all the issues that my colleagues here have already addressed as the General Assembly session approaches, as they relate to the criminal law, but I wanted to draw special attention to the civil issues that we expect to be facing.
Yep, thank you. So I'm going to ask a few more questions posed by our audience, and then I'm going to go around to each of the panelists with one last question for each of you. Delegate Atterbeary, I can see you've been engaged in a chat with someone in our audience who asked if you couldn't get gun legislation passed, how can you get any other the reform legislation passed? Now, passed may mean you can get it through the House or whatever, but what are the hopes for real reform with the Senate and with Governor Hogan in your standpoint?
So just as our governor vetoed my long gun background check bill, which we will override when we return to session, I suspect that he will likely veto police legislation that we do. And if he does, then we will have to override that veto as well. I think the tougher question is what, the House passes a package and the Senate passes a package, and we have to make sure we can have a meeting of the minds, because what we don't want to do is let this opportunity pass us by. This is our opportunity to do something bold and meaningful as it relates to police reform and accountability, and not to just pass something that looks nice and is flowery so we can all wave a banner. This is our one opportunity, and I don't know when we'll have another one, to pass meaningful reform for the citizens of Maryland. So, you know, I'm confident we can do that in the House, and we'll have to hash out whatever the Senate does. We'll try to work that out beforehand as much as we can, but we always seem to have a difference of opinion about things when it comes to the House and the Senate. But I'm confident, you know, I know Senator Smith really wants to pass meaningful reform as well. So I'm confident we will get something done.
All right. So the question of this will be for County Executive Elrich and Chief Jones, and anyone else can jump in, about school resource officers, a subject that has been getting a lot of attention. I know in our stories on Bethesda Beat, whenever that comes up, we get a huge amount of readership on those stories. Tell me your views on whether there should be school resource officers, what the best outcome is here, and I'll start with you, Chief Jones.
Okay. Thank you. So I am an avid supporter of SROs in our schools. I think that there is a lot of discussion that many people feel that the only function of a school resource officer is to arrest students, and that is not the primary goal of why school resources officers exist in our schools. They have a wide variety of responsibilities and work with Montgomery County Public Schools as a partner to provide you know, resources in a sense that they sometimes will have taught some classes. They are mentors to many of the students to provide them with some guidance. They're also there for the safety of the students, which is the primary function. And really to have the ability to have, as I spoke about earlier, about relationships. Having relationships with staff, the principal, and the students is vitally important. And we have many stories of successes where we have that focus. And we are in continuing dialogue with MCPS right now as they work through Dr. Smith and his staff to respond to the Board of Education into their inquiry about the value of the school resource program. And the one thing that I want people to really understand, for me as the chief of police, that I think is vitally important. If we didn't have school resource officers, the state of Maryland still requires us under the Safe Schools Act that it still requires us to have adequate coverage of police at our schools all across this county. Montgomery County has a lot of schools, elementary, middle, and high schools. And therefore, it would require a tremendous amount of work and responsibility for us to be able to get those officers to, in my mind, that I have to make sure that those schools are provided with adequate coverage that's beyond our normal patrol ranks at this point in time. So therefore, we'll still have that responsibility, whether there's a school resource officer program or not. But I believe that there's value. I know that there's people who believe that the numbers, and we can have those discussions about data. But I think at the end of the day, when we talk about that, there are things that are happening in our schools that require that we think parents want to make sure that kids are safe in going to a school environment, and we want them to be safe. And because that's something that's important to me. I have two kids that are actually teachers. All three of my kids actually graduated from MCPS schools, and I have two, you know, kids that are teachers, adults, but they are. I want to make sure that that staff is safe as well, and then that's one of the things that I think is a driving force behind us. But I really do believe we have a great school resource office team, and I encourage that they needed to be supported in our county.
County Executive Elrich, you're muted. You're muted. There you go. Well, still muted. There you go.
Okay. I think we both hit it at the same time. I have a more mixed view of SROs. When I was on the council, I always thought it was a sad use of resources. And I, come out of the world where we did not have SROs when I was in school. We didn't have police officers in school. It didn't mean everybody behaved well. There were less angelic people than others, but we didn't have police officers. And I think it is a sad use of resources that I'm spending money that I could be spending on teachers or as social workers or psychologists in the school. And Montgomery County schools are horribly out of line with recommendations for the number of school psychologists, social workers that we ought to have. And if I was going to make the investment, that's where I would put my investment. As executive, because this had always passed on the council and passed last year in the council, I saw no point in pulling it out of the budget, knowing that everybody on the council historically supported it. I discovered this year there's more division after events of the spring than there was before. But I'd be happy not to fund it. Marcus is right. We have under state law responsibility to provide rapid response or ability to respond to all schools. But if that were the case and I had to do that with all schools with resource officers, I'd need a couple hundred more policemen to cover all the schools in Montgomery County. So we're looking at other ways of doing this. We had made a proposal to the state for some grant money to see if they would let us do this a different way, where we would assign beats, and certain schools would be within a beat that an officer could get to reasonably quickly if they were needed. You got to remember the genesis of this was really about people coming in and shooting and being able to get there quickly. It's kind of morphed into something else. I think kids need to talk to social workers. I really do. And I think that we're psychologists, and there are more kids who have breakdowns than ever in my life. When I talk to young people and they tell me about they had a breakdown, the friend had a breakdown, the friend got transported out of a high school during a breakdown and spent 3 days in Montgomery General, whatever, it breaks my heart to think that this is the kind of stress these kids are under. And like I said, with limited resources, I'd be looking at social workers and psychologists.
Thank you. Congressman Raskin. A number of people have been asking in our audience, what can we do to help? And it wasn't addressed specifically to you, but it is addressed to all of you. But I'm asking, start with you. What can our viewers and people in general do to help in the cause here? You are muted.
I appreciate the question very much. We're going through a wrenching period, obviously, but it is one that's filled with a lot of hope and promise. But we really do need everybody's voice in there, and we need people participating at every level of government, at the local level, in the counties, and the state, and the federal. And we need people to be politically engaged and socially active. However possible. I agree very much with, both what Marc just said and Chief Jones just said. The young people are under tremendous pressure and anxiety. It's a time of extraordinary mental health and emotional health stress for people. And COVID-19 is complicating it because it's forcing a lot of distance and isolation on people. But we've got to figure out ways where people in our middle age can really reach out to young people as much as possible. I have the benefit of living in and representing a pretty blue district, and so I don't spend any money in my campaigns on TV, radio, polling, consultants, any of that stuff. And I've created a school that we call it Democracy Summer. That's for high school and college kids. And I think that all of us should feel some responsibility for education and for investing in young people in this tough time. It can't be left to the schools and the police, the resource officers. Everybody should be involved with young people as much as possible.
Now I'm muted. Does anyone else want to answer that question? All right, Attorney General Frosh, I have one for you. Then I'm going to go and ask each of the panelists a question. You have effectively banded together with attorneys general in other states, especially with some issues related to our president. How, I know you've started to do this, what are the ways do you think that you can band together with your colleagues in other states when it comes to social justice issues and use existing laws to try to right some of the wrongs?
Well, there really isn't a single entity to sue here, but this is something that I undertook from the moment I was sworn in. I mean, one of the first things that we did was create guidelines for every law enforcement agency in the state to tell them they cannot profile, they cannot use racial profiling, any form of discriminatory profiling. Turns out we were the first AG's office in the country to do that. We have sued the administration on a number of different occasions to stop the hate. I mean, we sued the president over the Muslim ban, and I think ultimately we're successful. There was a third iteration of it that roped in Korea and one other country so that it couldn't be accused of being a Muslim ban that persists. But ultimately, it stopped the flat-out discrimination against Muslims who were trying to enter our country. One of my initiatives early on again was to stop the use of money bail, dramatically reduce it. We were successful in that. We got the Court of Appeals to change the rules, and we have thousands fewer people in jail these days because we used to hold people for whom small amounts of bail had been set. They only needed 100, 200, $500 to get out of jail, but they didn't have it. So people were being incarcerated because they were poor. That's been reduced significantly. We still have a long way to go on that. In this past legislative session, our office sponsored legislation, and Delegate Atterbeary was extremely helpful in getting this passed, to stop, to take back the Motor Vehicle Administration's authority to suspend somebody's license for failing to pay a fine for even a minor traffic offense, failing to signal when turning or having a tail light out. People get socked with fines, they don't have the money, they don't show up in court, their license gets suspended, and you know, for the most part, it's very difficult to work in our state unless you have a car. And so folks drive anyway, and then they get arrested, stopped, arrested for driving on a suspended license, end up in jail, can't take the kids to school, can't get to the doctor, et cetera. So we got legislation passed that repealed that authority on MVA's behalf, and it won't happen anymore after October 1st. And the approximately 300,000 people who have suspended licenses right now in our state will have the ability to get them back. And if the pandemic lets up, they'll be able to go back to work and certainly be able to get their kids to school and get them to medical appointments. So this has been an ongoing process for us. The latest iteration or the latest effort has been with our COVID-19 Access to Justice Task Force. And as I said before, we're working on all the problems that affect folks from this illness in the civil context.
Thank you. Okay, last question for everyone, and then we're going to wrap things up. And we're going to start with you, Delegate Atterbeary, and with you, Congressman Raskin. It is, if there were one piece of legislation that you could say with regard to social justice issues that you could say, snap your fingers and have enacted, what would it be? That's the first part of the question. Second part of the question is, these are, you know, fairly dark times in our country. And you all are fighting in your various ways to create some light. Why, what gets you up in the morning? Why do you have some optimism about things are going to turn around? Let's start with you, as I said, Delegate Atterbeary.
Thank you, and thank you again for having me, since I'm the outlier, the non-Montgomery County person on this panel. That is a tough question. If I could just poof my fingers and have what I wanted passed, I would play the lottery and do all types of other things. I would just say, this might be cheating a little bit, but I would get our reform package that we want coming out of this work group. I would get it passed as it relates to the use of force, a statewide standard, body cameras. We would, magically have money for everyone to have body cameras. That is what I would get. I would hope for, and of course to override my veto on background checks for long guns. What motivates me? My 3 kids motivate me every day. My middle son, I've been turning around, he's, I'm doing a lot of negotiating here, but he's 7. And when he was 5, I remember I picked him up from kindergarten. We had just gotten out of session. So, we miss a lot of time with our kids. And so I said, I'm going to pick my kids up from school every day instead of them going to aftercare. And I remember I said, what did you do today in school? And he starts recounting how they did an active shooter drill. And he said to me, Mom, when I get shot, I hope I survive. And I had to hold back my tears because that wasn't a thing when I was growing up. We had, fire drills. I think that is the mentality of kids that are coming up today. That these things are actually going to happen. And, as an African-American mom raising 2 African-American boys and 1 little girl, and I can't, we can't discount girls anymore because we have the Sandra plans out there. It is scary. It has been very scary for me sitting in my house, and my grandmother, who's 91, is a retired sheriff from right outside of Detroit, Michigan in Wayne County. And she was a tough cookie and the first president of her local union there. So I have that perspective. And I also have the perspective of being a Black woman in America. And it's scary. I am literally scared for the future of my boys. I know how my brother was treated growing up here in Howard County. I know how my dad, traveling up 29 from the lovely Montgomery County, where he had his company for 30 years, to Howard County, I know how he was targeted and treated by police officers on a regular basis. So, it's a scary thing to think that your child could one day go out there in the streets and living their normal life, and because they're an African-American male and somebody doesn't understand them or it has interacted with African-Americans or brown and Black people, that they treat them differently. It's literally scary. I have had more talks with my children, particularly my 2 boys, about their appearance and how they have to act and how they have to behave. And I've been having these talks since Trayvon Martin happened, and my kids were like 4 and 3, my boys. I've had more since we have been locked down in this house since March because of the things that are going on. It's crazy and it's very scary. So that's what gets me up in the morning. That's why I ran for office. I think a lot of the things that have already been said, I believe all of our kids deserve an equal opportunity when it comes to education, when it comes to job opportunities, and when it comes to just living your life and being free from being treated from racial discrimination. So it's thinking about my kids and all the other kids in our state really, really gets me motivated every day.
Thank you, Delegate Atterbeary. We are running out of time, so I'm going to ask each of the rest of you in about 30 seconds. You can choose either your #1 legislative priority or the things that are cause for optimism for you. Chief Jones, we're turning to you.
Okay. For optimism, I'm sorry about that. For optimism, I will just say what gets me rolling every day is that I just have a strong sense that we as people know what we have to do to come together, that we know we have to bridge this gap. and that we need to communicate. Stop talking at each other, and we need to start talking to each other. And most importantly, we need to start listening. And I think when we're able to do that, regardless of what side you're on politically or on whatever side from what you look like or what your appearance is that people have to be willing to listen, and we need to work together. And I'm an optimist in that regard. I've always been brought up that way. And I just think that we can get this done if people are willing to do that, but you have to have a moral commitment to do that.
No. Thank you, Chief Jones, for being with us. County Executive Elrich, again, we're literally down to about 30 seconds each, so your top priority.
The stuff Brian talked about in terms of housing relief.
Mm-hmm.
We are facing a real tsunami. I wouldn't just do the housing, though. I'd include the small businesses and commercial property, because anybody who wasn't able to collect rent, which is like a paycheck or an actual paycheck, they are all about to get hammered. And the governor has, been doing these month-by-month postponements because he can, but sooner or later, there's going to be a reckoning. He's either going to stop his forbearance or, he'll have to continue this forever. We've got to come up with a solution. And if we don't, it's going to be a real social disaster.
Thank you, County Executive Elrich, for joining us. Attorney General Frosh, your thoughts in 30 seconds, if you wouldn't mind.
I'll do my best. So I want to recite for you some words that Senator Robert Kennedy spoke in 1968. It was the night Martin Luther King was assassinated. He was speaking at a rally in Indianapolis, and he told the crowd that Martin Luther King had been killed. And he went on to say this. He said, "What we need in the United States now is not division. What we need in the United States is not hatred. What we need in the United States is not violence or lawlessness, but love and wisdom and compassion for one another and a feeling of justice towards those who still suffer in our country." That's what my office's job is. Those are the things that we stand for. Those are the things that all of my friends who have spoken on this panel stand for and will fight for. And I can tell you that all of us are going to continue to fight for those objectives. And with people like Jamie and Marc and Vanessa and Chief Jones, I think we got a pretty good shot.
I was 13 years old when he uttered those words, and I remember them like they were yesterday.
Wow.
All right, Congressman Raskin, thank you for your patience. And I want to ask the question slightly different with you. It's January. The president is a Democrat. The Senate is Democrat. The House remains Democratic. First 100 days, what are the 3 pieces of legislation that are related to social justice that you would hope to see passed?
Well, I can't do 3, but I'll take the 300 that are sitting on Mitch McConnell's desk right now. So we spent the last 4 years working on it, and I think it's there. If I could just say a word on the optimism route question, Steve. My dad used to say, when everything looks hopeless, you're the hope. And I feel like we're a state, we're a community where people have really stood up, and I've derived so much solace from looking backwards into Maryland. I think I told you, Steve, that I was working on a rewrite of our state song, which is still stuck in the Civil War era on the wrong side of the Civil War. But it's been beautiful thinking about the magnificent people throughout our history who have fought for freedom and democracy, justice, and the environment that we love so much, that Brian Frosh defends every day. So I've gotten a lot of hope from our state itself and the people in it who are always willing to struggle.
Would you like to end by singing what you've got so far for the state song?
No, but I'll direct you to YouTube, where you hear a real singer from Prince George's County, a 17-year-old still in high school in North End. She's amazing.
Yeah.
London is amazing.
Thank you, Congressman Raskin, and thank you to all of our panelists for being here today. I'm now going to turn it back to Honorable St. Gerard, who is the chair of the Committee for Montgomery, and thank you all for being here.
Yes, Steve, thank you very much for moderating this very informative panel. And I want to thank the speakers, Congressman Raskin, Delegate Atterbeary, County Executive Elrich, Chief Jones, and Attorney General Frosh. Thank you all. I hope the audience got a lot out of it. I know as CFM, we got a lot out of it, and we are hoping to take a lot of what was discussed back to our personal discussions and working on our advocacy as we move forward with that. To close out, I do want to thank our sponsors, Virtual Apprentice and Riveting Women. And then I also want to thank our planning committee, the CFM planning committee, for putting together the program. You worked very hard. It went off without a hitch, so I thank you very much for that. And as for the audience, please be on the lookout for more information on future virtual events and discussions on voting, budget, healthcare, transportation, education, and at the conclusion of session, whenever that happens, we hope it starts on time in January, we'll have a wrap-up session as well. And if you'd like to sponsor any of the events, please reach out to CFM, and we'd be happy to discuss that. But overall, I want to thank everybody once again for this, and please have a great night, and we hope to see you again in the future. Thank you very much.